So in this section, chapter 7, we find that KP kind of brought up the topic of suffering. He says this on the beginning. He says, "No one, I am convinced, will follow Jesus very long without tribulation," or trials is another word. It is God's way of demonstrating his presence. Sufferings and trials, like persecution, are a normal part of the Christian walk, which is a kind of a shocking statement because he says, is suffering and trials normal? Like, are you expected that trials and suffering is normal? Oh, I'm going to move that up here to the top of the screen and give me a little bit bigger. As I was noticing last week's was a little small and hard to see. But I want to introduce you to this guy. That his name is Watchman Nee. He was an underground church pastor that in China that was put into prison early on. He wrote a number of tracts. So this was back in the early 30s, 1930s. And he says, good is not always God's will, but God's will is always good. And then he continues on and he says, growing in your spiritual life will always condition on suffering and loss. We cannot measure our lives in terms of gain, but only in terms of loss. If our hearts are not separated from the love of the world, then our soul has yet to go through the cross. It's an interesting quote, especially this idea. He says, growing in your spiritual life is conditioned on suffering loss. And what I want to hit home on this a little bit is this idea that suffering, I think, and trials and hardship is normal in the Christian life. It's following Jesus. He says you have to deny yourself. You need to love others. You need to love God. And the reality is that he was persecuted. Jesus was persecuted. He says, Paul and Barnabas, after being beaten, they said that through many trials and tribulations is how you enter the kingdom of God. And 1 Timothy says that anybody who wants to be like Christ has to or will be persecuted. The reality is that every gain requires some sort of loss. Follow my thoughts on this one. Making sacrifices for future gain is actually very normal in life, right? So, for example, if you have so much time in the day and you have to lose time playing video games in order to have time to do homework, right? I need to give up on something in order to get something. So its idea is I'm going to give up some of my time here in order to work on something here. I want to be better at a sport, so I need to stop watching videos, right? Or something like that. There's always a loss when it comes to gain. So if I want to go work, then that means I'm going to lose a little bit of my freedom because now I'm making an income. And the idea with this is that, we are going to gain heaven. Well, we lose hell. It's a good exchange, don't get me wrong. And Jesus calls this is we want to gain God's will. But in order to gain God's will, I have to sit down and lose my will. It can't be my will and God's will. It's God's will. And then in that, I lose my will. But the nice thing is with Jesus and with following him is as you give up, he gives back hundredfold. And so as I sacrifice for him, he is richly rewarding me either in the present or in the future. I want to give you another example of somebody who might have gone through loss. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this one, Saint Telemachus. He was a monk who tried to stop a gladiator fight in a Roman amphitheater. So if you don't know, the gladiators would go in, they'd kill each other. He was pretty violent and brutal. And what was interesting, this was actually happening while Rome was still Christian. This is after Constantine. For the next 100 years, while the whole Roman Empire essentially became Christians, they would still go to these amphitheaters and watch soldiers or watch people or prisoners kill each other for sport. It was like their entertainment today. Anyway, he jumped into the ring and immediately he was killed. And the question is, was his suffering and his death worth it? So I'm going to splice in a quick video from another person who shared what St. Telemachus did and then jump back on. But before you watch, was just jumping in the ring saying stop and then getting killed, was it worth it?